Hello, this is Bill Bullard with RCAF USA, the voice of the independent cattle producer in the United States of America. Well, in the early 2000s, the International Tribunal, known as the World Organization for Animal Health, which is part of the World Trade Organization, began issuing directives to countries encouraging them to implement a national animal identification system to facilitate international trade even in the midst of global animal disease outbreaks. The U.S. Department of Agriculture, or USDA, was an obedient follower of global governance, and it set out in earnest to implement a far-ranging national animal identification system, which the government called NAIS, or NAIS. The USDA had no qualms about trampling on the private property rights of independent cattle producers. The USDA pushed hard to require all cattle producers to register their premises with the federal government. It pushed hard to require every cattle producer to affix radio frequency identification, or RFID, ear tags to all their animals. And it pushed hard to require cattle producers to report to the federal government each time they moved their livestock from one premises to another. The USDA's plan and its feverish actions answered the cattle industry's question, "Big Brother, where art thou?" Well, Big Brother was right here and was pounding on the door of every U.S. cattle producer. Well, the cattle industry organized, and it organized fast. We stood up to the USDA's Orwellian plan and said, "We don't and won't do this in the United States of America." So robust was our opposition that the USDA backed down and began rethinking its strategy. We convinced the agency that it had no authority to mandate premises registration or the use of RFID technology within the states. If it had any authority to issue such mandates at all, that authority was limited to interstate commerce. So the agency moved ahead and did what it thought it could do. It required mandatory animal identification when adult cattle were shipped from one state to another. But the agency continued fuming over its inability to heed the globalist directive that every country implement a national animal identification system. And then there was a paradigm shift. The failed NAIS plan was quietly transferred from the hands of the government to the hands of private entities, namely to the multinational globalists themselves. The world's largest multinational meat packers and multinational RFID manufacturers formed their own private corporation known as the Global Roundtable for Sustainable Beef, or GRSB. The new GRSB is a transnational private corporation that is now carrying the banner for the old NAIS, and it wants to implement premises registration and mandatory RFID technology just as badly as the USDA does. Where the government tried and failed to implement NAIS using governmental authority to issue directives and then enforce those directives through civil penalties, the new GRSB is trying to force compliance with RFID and premises registration mandate by restricting access to the private marketplace. The process is well underway. Already, some of the multinational GRSB members are making market access contingent upon producers first obtaining certain certifications for livestock handling. Now, it's no stretch to imagine the next market access contingency will be a requirement to register premises and affix RFID ear tags. The USDA thinks this plan is brilliant and couldn't wait to jump on board. It offered a lending hand by issuing a directive to require mandatory use of RFID ear tags by January 1 of 2023 for every cattle producer who wants the privilege of shipping adult cattle across state lines. Well, we stopped them for now. We filed a lawsuit, and in response, the USDA withdrew its unlawful RFID mandate. But even when it did so, it reiterated its goal to require RFID use in the near future. It's important to note that there's nothing inherently wrong with RFID technology. We have many members who voluntarily use the technology, and they are currently receiving economic rewards in the form of market premiums. However, RFID becomes wrong when it is mandated either by the government or by private actors. And once the mandate goes into effect, regardless of who is doing the mandating, the premiums now being earned in the marketplace will evaporate. That's simply the outcome of such a mandate. You can't stop this yourselves. It's too big. And none of the conventional cattle organizations who have already joined with the GRSB have any intentions of stopping this. They support it. No, if you want to preserve your right to remain independent and choose for yourself what production standards to follow, then you will have to organize with your neighbors to strengthen your individual voices. And that's what RCAF USA is all about. Your support matters, and if you'd like to help us continue our successful representation of the interests of independent cattle producers, please go to www.r-calfusa.com and join with us. With that, we're out of time. Thank you and goodbye.